Hey, Tiny Cupcake. Good to see you again. All right. So, we're going to go ahead and get started. Today, we are talking to Rachel. They are an accessibility engineer. Very excited to speak with you today, as you are one of the people who have taught me something that I feel is profound about web accessibility with all of your trainings. So we're just going to get started by having you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, a little bit about your journey, and then from there I'll ask you enough questions that'll touch on everything.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I'm Rachel DiTullio. I started out as a front-end web developer for many, many years. I got my first web developer job in 2000, so I've been doing this a while. A few years ago, I'd started learning about like web standards and to some extent accessibility in the mid 2000s, but I didn't really get into accessibility until maybe 10 years ago or so. I I went to grad school and I was studying user experience design and took some classes in the School of Social Work for making systems work for people with disabilities and started learning on my own about accessibility and was fortunate enough in my developer job to be able to apply a lot of the stuff that I was learning. My team was pretty receptive to it. So I was also doing a lot of outreach within my own company, trying to let people know about accessibility as well and why we should be concerned and be implementing accessible practices. And then I decided to get certified, some of the IAAP certifications, and with that, I actually just became an accessibility engineer a couple years ago and decided to leave development behind more or less other than updating my WordPress site. But yeah, so now I'm a senior accessibility engineer at Citizens Bank, um, and I work internally with our various development pods, reviewing work that they've done and providing accessibility feedback and letting folks know how to, think about accessibility challenges and also remediate anything that might be existing.
Okay, that is a lot. That's really interesting. One thing I wanted to ask about was you mentioned basically you got your first job in 2000, so that was quite a while ago. You were working a little bit
Yes.
as I guess, a front end web developer, and then you kind of fell down that rabbit hole of accessibility as you started learning more. I was really
Yeah.
interested to hear a little bit more about. You said you were taking a class about making systems work for people with disabilities. What did you learn in that class? Any interesting tidbits
Yeah.
that we can take with us?
I think what I found most interesting about it is like I didn't know there was a discipline of disability studies, and it really, opened up my world as far as, why is accessibility important? Who are we doing this for? What are some of the challenges that just come out of the disability community? There's a saying that goes on now, nothing about us without us. I didn't know the saying then, but I mean, I can reflect back on my time just that it was interesting. We covered all kinds of topics like how does Medicaid work? What are things? I live in the state of Texas, so what are resources that for disabled people available in the state of Texas? It was an interesting class, but both of the classes I took were sort of self-paced learning classes. Even though they were graduate classes, I didn't have to go to class for them. I was able to, the teacher provided a syllabus of, selected readings and activities and that kind of thing. Sort of got to build what I wanted to learn about. So we went to certain events like volunteering for Special Olympics. Then we also, looked at pop culture and things like that, critically from a disabled perspective. Like we watched certain films that the professor suggested and kind of looked at like how is disability treated in this film, and what can we take away from it? Was it, did it have an empathetic perspective, or was it like pitying people, that kind of thing? Like how is disability used? Frequently disability gets used for like villain characters and that kind of stuff. So yeah, this class was just like super interesting. It was really just like all about disability studies and what we can learn, and that's where I also learned about like the different models of disability, like the social model versus the medical model, and how that can affect folks.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. I love when people take the time to learn about the foundation of disability itself, because I think a lot of times
Yeah.
we kind of jump into accessibility, web accessibility, specifically digital. We're just like, we know that there are people with disabilities and these are the things that we need to fix, without really thinking about like, what does disability mean? Who are the people I'm serving? When I was doing occupational therapy, all we did was the medical model all the time. So we saw people as like, this thing that we had to fix, versus understanding the social model, when it's like, having people kind of envelop into society. We all help, versus like seeing it as a problem to fix. And I feel like that sometimes is something that's kind of missing in our field. I wish
Yeah.
that we had a little bit more of that background knowledge. So that's really great. You talked about some certifications in the IAP. I wanted to talk about that a little bit, but we're going to come back to it.
Okay.
Let's talk a little bit more about your journey as an engineer now. So right now you're telling me it sounds like you used to do some coding. What were your languages, by the way? What languages were you coding in over your tenure?
Yeah, so I worked at a very large software company that had a lot of legacy code, and so the team that I was on I was there for about 14 years. We were using an in-house content management system built on Java and JSP. So if there was any server-side scripting that needed to be done, it was always in JSP. But I was on a team of other developers, and I primarily focused on the front end, worrying about the HTML and CSS of things, and other folks did more of the back end or scripting for the site. So yeah, it was a lot of HTML. And that's where my interest in all of this came out of, was like learning about semantic HTML and coding the right way, not just the way that like gets you the visual effect that you want, but is also semantically communicating the information.
Right. I don't remember if you talked about what exactly got you like super interested in accessibility specifically. Did you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I can. So yeah, this was while I was in graduate school at UT Austin. I found out about an accessibility conference that happens every year here in Austin called Access U from Nobility. And I was able to go to that conference in 2011. And from that point on, while I was finishing up graduate school in the next year and everything, that's when I started really shifting my focus towards accessibility and learning what I could on my own. It was kind of slow going, and like I said, I was able to apply some of the things that I learned, immediately within my job. But I didn't even do my first like real audit until 2015. So
Okay. So, this is a pretty broad question, but like, what is your favorite thing about being an accessibility engineer, especially when you compare it to just when you were doing full front end development?
yeah, I like sort of the, I guess, teaching aspect of it. You know, most of the developers that I've run into in my career didn't know anything about accessibility till we got to talking about it, or maybe they'd heard something, but they didn't know much about it. They didn't know what to do to be accessible. And so, working with developers and helping them think about these problems, think about solutions for interesting, complex widgets, testing those things out and making sure that they work with assistive technology like screen readers. That's what I enjoy. Like getting other people into accessibility is my favorite part.
Yeah, that is really fun. I love how people think that it's going to be boring, and then you're like, no, it's so fun. There's so many things to do.
Yeah.
All right, so what are the top three offenders you see all the time when it comes to auditing a website?
Uh, well, I can look at this from two perspectives. From a general, like normal web development, like you have different pages on your website. You're not doing a single page application. Um, a lot of times I see controls that I either cannot tab to them with the keyboard, and even if I can, they don't work with the keyboard. Like you can't activate them with the enter or space keys. So sort of keyboard related issues I think are and those are also the most critical ones, right? Because
Right.
if someone has a screen reader, there are sometimes workarounds for that. Like controls will announce that they're clickable, even if they only work with like a JavaScript mouse click. You can still trigger it with the screen reader, but for just keyboard only users, it can really cut them off from a lot of parts of the application. So that's the first one. Um, the next one, it's probably around what I would call uh, well, both not just using headings properly, but also landmarks properly. And this again helps screen reader users kind of figure out what's on the page and scan the content, figure out where they can go to quickly. But a lot of times, folks are either using text that visually looks like a heading, but is not actually marked up as a heading using a H1 to H6 element. Um, and oftentimes landmarks are just used incorrectly. So with landmarks, it's kind of all or nothing. If you have some content marked up with a landmark, all of your content needs to be in the appropriate landmark to really be effective. And so I'll see folks who maybe they just have one landmark on the page, but the rest of the content is unlandmarked, things like that. That it just makes it more difficult for folks to navigate the page. Um, and I would say, what's a good one? Trying to think. Sorry, I've been doing a lot of single page applications recently, and I don't want to answer just for that. um, Well, I guess I can. Something that needs to happen, at least with single page applications, is if you are managing state, like you're updating the URL when you go to a different screen. You also need to be updating the page title, and you have to use a live region to announce that page title for screen reader users. Additionally, since it's a single page application, you have to manage focus intentionally. So, like with separate when you have separate web pages and you're actually making a new HTTP request when you go to a link, you know that will start at the top of the page. That'll read the page title. You'll be at the beginning of the content. But with a single page application, let's say you click a button to submit a form. Suddenly the page content changes, but focus will be lost because the button that had keyboard focus and programmatic focus is no longer on the page. So focus just, the browser doesn't know what to do. It tries to remember where you were on the page, but it's not bringing you back to the beginning of the content, even though the experience for the end user is of going to a new page. But the technology is a single page application, and so you have to manage that focus.
Right, right. So basically, what Rachel was talking about is the accessibility of the page, especially when thinking about like navigating only with the keyboard, because there are so many users who don't use a mouse due to various reasons. And then people who are using a screen reader, the screen reader is announcing everything on the screen, but is going to be, if you don't have everything written correctly, it's not going to announce certain things, especially if you have things that are like auto updating or updating after you click them. Um, I wanted to pause and talk about some of your trainings that you've done, because you are one of the people that I learned like something that I found super profound. It was very nerdy, but when I learned it, it was an aha moment for me, and I thought it was so interesting. You did, I think it was for DQ University, you did a talk on forms. And at the time, I was learning how to build accessible forms because I've never learned how to do that. Now that I'm like auditing, I know what to look for. I know how to make things work, and how to tell people how to build things, but I've never like built something myself and understood under the hood what makes it accessible. So when I was looking at inputs and labels, like, I have an idea of what those things are. I just didn't really understand how they worked together. So when I learned that if you have your inputs and labels labeled together so that everything is contained in that area, it like expands the clickable area outside of just the
Yeah.
form field. It also expands it to like the text. So if something says phone number and then it has like, the little box, the box is selectable, but it also is selectable out to that phone number text so that you can press it or click it and it still goes to that form field. And I know that's like
Yeah.
super random, but like it like blew my mind when I was like, "Oh my god, I understand why this matters."
Yeah.
So that's really cool. Can you tell us more about some of those talks and trainings that you've done and things that you really like talking about, and where you've been speaking this year?
Sure. So yeah, the structuring accessible forms talk, that was for XCon. And so there's a recording out there if anybody wants to watch that talk. I also have links on my website to like the slides for all of this stuff
We'll
if
be
you want to
linking
check it
that
out.
right now, actually, y'all.
Um, yeah, so that's all about accessible considerations for forms, from labeling to validating error messages, validating data input, kind of how you want to handle your form submit and returning error messages and that kind of thing. Um, I'll be giving a talk next month at Utah JS. It's the very first talk I actually came up with. It's called "The Web is Inherently Accessible," and it's all about semantic HTML and using ARIA appropriately to kind of as a helper when and using semantic HTML to the extent that it gives us power in the browser and not just relying on ARIA when there are HTML ways to do things and scripting. We don't have to always script everything. There are some out of the box interesting things that we get that just don't get a lot of attention, like the details and summary elements in HTML. That provides a natural disclosure. Yeah, it provides a natural
What?
disclosure element. Yeah. So you don't have to use like, a typical accordion where you have a button and you have to have JavaScript to like expand and contract the panel. You can use details and summary and it just does it for you. It's well supported in browsers now. So
Wow,
did I
that's
just blow your mind?
actually yes. Because now I'm just like, um, I feel like I just learned the other day that HTML is semantic, and that semantic
Mm,
just means that it like literally gives you extra controls that come out of the box just by like tagging it correctly. So you're telling me that there's a details tag that can do something really specific. I'm definitely gonna like go down a rabbit hole after this. But yeah, this is why we need you in the web accessibility study group to,
yeah,
to come teach. Oh
I
my
will be there.
gosh. Oh my goodness. You know so much. It's so interesting. I have so many questions, but I want to keep this within an hour this time.
Okay.
So I'm going to kind of jump over to neurodivergence. So a lot of
Okay.
people who are kind of in this community um, have some understanding or are neurodivergent. So I thought that would be a really interesting topic to talk about. I'm kind of curious about how being neurodivergent has impacted you in your career and in your job, and if there are any special accommodations or anything like that that you use for yourself. I'm just kind of curious about your experience working.
Sure. So I'll start out by saying like I didn't know I was neurodivergent for a long, long time. Like when I was a kid, they really didn't diagnose girls with autism. And I figured out maybe 5 years ago that I'm probably autistic. I don't have an official diagnosis. I had one session with a psychologist, and unfortunately, the way diagnosing autism in adults works in this country is they still want to talk to your parents and find out how you were as a child because the only diagnostic criteria we have is for children. So,
Mm.
I didn't want to go through that and have her talk to my parents about that kind of stuff. So I just said, you know what? I'm probably autistic, and that's how I'm going to live. I did get diagnosed though with ADHD around the same time. So knowing both those things about myself, you when you learn that information, you kind of look back over your whole life and go, oh, certain things suddenly make a lot of sense. Why I had, this personality conflict with someone, or I didn't understand what was going on in this situation. So yeah, the way. the way it affects me nowadays is, I'm really lucky. I started working from home like a lot of folks did with the pandemic. I ended up changing jobs last year and found a remote only job, so I wasn't gonna be forced back into the office. And that's something that I think is hugely important for a lot of neurodivergent people. I see a lot of folks on Twitter, talking about how that accommodation, I mean, it really is an accommodation for a lot of us. Being able to control our environment and the kind of sensory information that we're getting. The last office that I worked in was really uncomfortable for me. We had these bright fluorescent lights above our cubes, and it just really did a number on me. I ended up getting this like sports umbrella for using outside, but I put it in my cube to kind of like block this light from just glaring from up above me every day.
Understand.
But and it was always too, yeah, and it was always too cold in the office, and you know, just yeah, there's just a lot of sensory things that I think can affect neurodivergent folks. That when you can control more of your environment, it definitely is a better working situation. In terms of like dealing with other people, again, looking back on my life, I realized. I've always struggled a bit with change, and having my routine disrupted. So I'm definitely an autistic person that likes routine. I like knowing what's going to happen. I really dislike it when someone sends me a meeting notice like less than a day in advance. So those are things I've learned, are not, it's no longer just like a trigger for me that someone sent me this email message. Or this, meeting request for maybe later in the day. I feel empowered to push back and say, I really need 24 hours or whatever to get ready. Can we meet tomorrow? Things like that. Just learning ways to cope with those stresses that used to kind of I I was just like not as good as handling them. It would really stress me out.
I'm curious. This is just something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and something that I did in my previous career. But do you have like official accommodations at work?
uh, I do not. I have worked with other autistic folks that ask for accommodations. I had a colleague who, you know, and she also had a lot of evidence that working 6 hours instead of 8 hours a day is just more productive. And so she was able to get an accommodation to just work 6 hours a day instead of eight
Whoa.
hours a day, something like that. So yeah, she had to take a
Oh,
pay
I was
cut
like,
to
they're gonna
do that,
pay
but
her for that? That's amazing. Okay.
no, yeah, I don't I when I apply for jobs, I always disclose that I have a disability. Like on US applications, they seem to always ask that question. So I do tell them that I have one, but I haven't requested any particular accommodations. At my last job last year, I was suffering from burnout, probably autistic burnout. It sounds like a lot of neurodivergent folks experience this. And so, my company had like a short-term disability policy, and I was able to, I went to my doctor and I explained what was going on, and he, signed a letter that said like I could take 8 weeks to recover. And so I was able to still get paid part of my salary through the short-term disability policy. So if folks work at a mid to larger company, they might have that opportunity if they're feeling like they're burnt out.
Right. That's really interesting. Not something I've really considered, but that's really good information to share and know.
Yeah.
Good tidbit. So I wanted to hear about how this impacts technology. So as a accessibility engineer who's thinking about accessibility digitally at all times during the workday, how can we impact accessibility in like a good way for neurodivergent folks? Like, what can we
Sure.
do?
Yeah, so when folks are usually talking about these kind of accessibility, I don't want to call them fixes, but accommodations, they're usually filed under cognitive, um, I don't want to say cognitive disabilities necessarily, but cognitive conditions, because,
Right.
folks might have anything from anxiety to OCD, to
Mm-hmm.
Tourette. I mean, there's a lot of things that fall under neurodivergent and cognitive conditions. So, um, yeah, things we can think about are, and I learned a lot of this from my colleague at my last job, who was also autistic. But she talked about things like um, your color palettes, like not using really bright, um, jarring colors that can cause folks anxiety just from seeing like a bright red. Like it's typical to use bright red for error messages, but that might not be the best choice. I have an article on my site where I did an assessment of a form for buying movie tickets and looked at it from that cognitive lens. And one of the things I noticed is like, yeah, they were using this red background with white text to note their error messages, and it really is kind of like off-putting in a sense. And I suggested maybe they could use a different color from their palette for that. There's nothing that says error messages have to be red. And of course, we don't rely on color alone anyway for error messaging or any
Right,
kind of messaging.
right.
We shouldn't rely on color alone. So um, another thing that I run into a lot is knowing like what fields to actually fill out on a form. There's no there's no standard convention, I'll say, in terms of marking required fields. Certainly, a lot of folks used asterisks, but that's not everyone. At my work now, instead of marking which fields are required, they mark which ones are optional, and that just causes me a lot of anxiety. Like I want to know exactly what I need to fill out, and if there's not something telling me I have to fill it out, I still question it. Like I don't accept that as like the default. The required should not be the default state for, I don't know, like you should be asking as little information as necessary. So if there's like a whole bunch of form fields, like my brain just says no, these can't all be required. That's not right. um, so yeah, so that's a consideration. You'll see a lot of talk too about plain language.
Mm-hmm.
Not dumbing it down, but making concepts simplified. Making sure that instructions are straightforward. Start with verbs. Really, you can leave out fluff words, and this applies again to things like error messages. A lot of times you'll see something like please enter your first name. Well, if you use the word please, it kind of implies that it's a choice. Like I don't have to enter my first name, but if it's a required field, they do have to enter their first name. So just saying like enter your first name is a little bit easier to process than please enter your first name. So even little tiny things like that. And making sure that error messages tell you how to enter the information that's being required. A lot of
Exactly.
times there's some format they want your phone number to be a certain way or whatever, but it's not necessarily explicit like on the form, like how do you want me to enter this? And so that causes a lot of cognitive dissonance for me. um, but yeah.
Yeah. That one is one of my specific, like, when I see it, I'm just like, oh my God. Why? I know some other ones for anyone listening who's curious about some other ways you can help with this. A good use of like white space, making sure things that are visually like not cluttered, using like bullet points and like separating paragraphs, not using jargon, not using a lot of like acronyms, because you know what JAVA is, but you be explicit about
Yeah.
what that is.
Yep.
I know another one is like make sure your forms are autofillable, and make sure that you don't have a lot of busyness on your page as far as like things moving around back and forth, or like just moving in general, and obviously no music playing automatically, which for the most part people don't do anymore, but there is still a lot of websites where the video will start
Yeah, the video.
automatically.
Oh, I don't like
You're
that.
just like, oh my goodness, why
I
did you do
especially don't like
this?
background video. I don't know why that ever became a thing. Because most of the
Yeah.
time there's no way to pause it. But
Right, right, right. Or like when you get on a page and it has like a carousel, but the carousel moves
oh
every
yeah.
3 seconds. And I'm just like, I'm leaving this page because I'm gonna throw up. Like,
Yep.
not from like the
Hmm.
disgust that they used it, but just like the vertigo of just like I'm just like, I can't deal with
Yep.
this. I'm bouncing.
Hmm.
But yeah, those are some of the good ones. Um, all right, let's see what else I wanted to ask you about. One thing I was curious about is, and also for anyone who's in here with us, you can ask questions at any time. I'm kind of looking at the chat, so I'll pause to answer some questions if anyone has questions. But Hulda does have a question before I get into some of my other questions. They asked, talking about simple language, are there any tips on alt text description? Up until recently, I was misinformed and was using sixth grade level instead of audience based. So, any tips?
Oh, yeah. That's actually an interesting question. I haven't heard alt text talked about specifically in the context of plain language, but um, I mean, long story short, you want to provide enough of a description that you're conveying the meaning of the image. And I mean, there's no set length to that text unless it's created by the content authoring system that you're using. But I mean, in HTML, there's no limit to the length of your alt text. And yeah, I mean, depending on the context that the image is used, it might have different alt text on a different page than another page. So don't be afraid to like change your alt text if you use the same image in a different context. But yeah, I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that you need to write at a sixth grade level. Definitely not. It really depends on the audience of the material. If you had, a complex diagram in a journal article, you probably wouldn't use sixth grade language to describe that. So, yeah, I think it just depends on
Right.
context.
Yeah.
What do you think?
My understanding for alt text is make it as concise as you can while
Yeah,
explaining explicitly what's happening. So if it's important and
yeah,
the user should know what's on there, then you just explain it, with as little words as possible because the usually if someone's looking at alt text, they might be using a screen reader and it's really annoying to go through like a paragraph
yeah,
unless you need a
for sure.
paragraph to explain it. But I've never heard the sixth grade level versus audience based. I don't even know what audience based may mean. Does that mean that it changes based on the audience? But yeah, alt text is it's for some reason while like a simple concept, like just writing good alt text becomes its own topic.
It does. And I've seen, yeah, and a lot of folks, if you search for like alt text decision trees, there are several of those floating around that kind of give you an idea of what even deciding if something's decorative or not, and does it need alt text in the first place.
Right, right. One of the things I'm learning heavily right now is like, is this decorative? And explaining that to people like stakeholders, because sometimes I feel like they get confused and then I get confused because then I'm like, if I'm looking at someone's stuff, I'm like, well, is it decorative? Like I'm asking you because this is your
Yeah.
project. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like it is, but you put the alt text in there, so it's a little confusing. Um, but one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because this is one of your topics of like you're a whiz at this, is human centered. I think it was human centered design, right? Am I
Hmm.
saying that correctly?
Um, yeah, that's one of the things I call it. I usually use inclusive design, but human-centered
There we
is
go. I'm
also,
like, there's
yeah.
a missing word. Inclusive design. Can you give us a brief overview of like some things we should know about that, like that we can take away with us?
Sure. The first thing I think to note is that the term inclusive design is a little bit divisive nowadays. There are definitely folks in the accessibility community that see that perspective as somewhat harmful, and the reason is, like at its roots, inclusive design is trying to design one thing to serve all or many um, ends, and you can't, accessibility sometimes is in conflict with itself.
Yeah.
What's accessible for one person may not work for another person. So if you're only looking at it from this perspective of like, I'm going to build the one great thing, you may be leaving people out. So I think it's always important. I think of it from the perspective of, if it's inclusive, it's adaptable. I think adaptability is the most important thing with accessibility because you just don't know what device or browser or technology or screen reader, whatever that someone's going to be using to access that content. So if the more use cases that you can satisfy, the more likely that your product is going to be inclusive. But if you think, some folks just think like, oh, I've done this from an inclusive design aspect, so therefore it must be accessible for everyone. That's just not the case. There's always going to be some people that are left out, and sometimes we have to make those decisions. But if we're doing something robust, the people that we're leaving out is it's not going to be that many, or there may
Right.
be workarounds.
Right. So I'm always trying to be more mindful of the words that I use, and by doing that, listen to the people that it's impacting. And I've noticed that a
Hmm.
lot of different words are now considered not good to use that we've been using for so many years, especially in the medical field. I know special needs is one of those words that I've used for like 10 years because that's just what we called it in the
Yeah.
field. And now I want to gag whenever I hear it. So whenever I hear, I'm like, can we say inclusive? Like I understand what they're saying, pretty much saying like, you can't really have anything be inclusive in and of itself. I guess I guess I'm trying to wrap my mind around what word I can use otherwise, or if I should continue to use that word.
Yeah. Well, where I'm at is I certainly recognize the criticisms of it, but I still think it's a good descriptor. I still use it. I would still say I am a proponent of inclusive design, but with the caveat that I recognize, that there are going to be gaps. And it's just, I think as long as you kind of come at it with an open perspective, and don't think like it's one and done, then you're looking at it and from a healthy
Right,
perspective,
right.
I guess. But I always, I am on Twitter every day and Mastodon, and looking at what the community is saying, and I'm certainly flexible on those things. If I see a particular term has fallen out of fashion, or a particular organization, I look into it, and I'll adjust if need be. So if this, who knows, next week they might come out and say that don't use inclusive design, so then I wouldn't. But we'll see.
Because a lot of times I'm like, I feel y'all. I feel what you're saying. It makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm like, let me just like keep
Yep.
listening, keep my ear to the ground. No.
Hmm. Yeah.
But what are some principles, some important principles of inclusive design? And Hulda said Ali is constantly learning, which is awesome. And speaking of like things that are controversial, even the A11Y is one of those things where people are like, is that even
Yep.
accessible? And I'm like, bro, I get it. I know. Like, what can we do? I guess we can stop using it, but it is kind of cute. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely jargony. It definitely came out of like the tech perspective on things, because,
Yeah.
there are other examples of things like this, like I-18N, for internationalization, but it's
Hmm.
just not something we come across a lot. But I use it at work for, I have office hours every day, and I call them the A11Y office hours. I was hoping more than anything probably just get people's attention.
Like, what is that? It can't be accessibility. They hear accessibility and they're like, oh, I don't want to do it. Like, what is this AY? And then you reel them in. They're like, oh, now I love it. Okay, so some principles of inclusive design.
Sure. So there are, I mean, this is defined as a methodology. So there are 7 principles of inclusive design. And there's a really handy website that will tell you all about it, inclusivedesignprinciples.org. Some folks that you may know from the community, like Leonie Watson and Hayden Pickering, contributed to these. So yeah, I can just tell you what the 7 are, and we can talk about whichever ones you want. The first one is to provide a comparable experience, depending, regardless of what device or situation you're in. Consider the situation that somebody is accessing your content. Be consistent about ways that you present similar things and be consistent across your designing your website, like using navigation consistently, that kind of stuff. You want to give control to the user. That kind of goes to the adaptability idea. You want to offer choice in how to interact with the content. You want to prioritize content over anything else in the design. Let content dictate design rather than the other way around. And then make sure that whatever you're doing is adding value to the experience. So those are the 7 principles.
Appreciate it. Um, okay, we're running. We have about, I would say, 15-ish more minutes to go. I'm going to spend the last
Okay,
couple of
sure.
those answering questions and talking about the study group and some other things. I think we have a question now. And let me see what this question says. So Hilda asked, have you experienced a situation where you have to balance accessibility and marketing, specifically as it relates to SEO? For example, making a logo, a link instead of an H1 header. I just learned about this overlap this week. Curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, so I used to work in marketing and or like I was in the marketing department even though I worked on websites. So I've, I've kind of gone around and stuff. So yeah, I've definitely worked with marketing folks. And even now, we support the marketing website for the bank. But specifically to your question, like what element do you use in affecting SEO? I'm not real privy to those conversations anymore. They don't really ask my opinion. I think SEO is totally in marketing's realm now, and I'm in the user experience group, so just doesn't come up for me. But I would say in terms of priorities, marketing seems to prioritize SEO efforts over accessibility efforts right now, where I work. So that there's always a bit of conflict from that perspective. Like, do we add a skip to content link, for keyboard users, or are we creating 10 new pages, things like that. So um, in terms of SEO, the biggest thing that they're looking at is broken links. And those seem to affect the score of our website using Site Improve. So, and that's definitely something that needs to be taken care of. I'm not going to, I'm just not in the position to make the decision, which of these things should be the highest priority. But I definitely have seen conflicts in that. But I mean, more or less, we're trying to attack both of these initiatives, SEO and accessibility, at the same time. um, but yeah, I can see how that could come up as an accessibility question, like which would give us the best SEO. And I mean, I'm just not that well versed in it anymore.
Yeah, the problem with SEO and accessibility is SEO is the moneymaker and how the business is going to get the funds
Yeah,
to pay for accessibility. But even though, we could argue all day about how it should be baked in, but it is what it is.
yeah.
So it's like a kind of like double edged like war in which you're like, I really want this to be accessible, but they also need to make their money. It it's like ethics
Yeah,
versus, the final dollar, which is it always comes down to. So I think being able to finesse and talk about how accessibility can help SEO is like a good skill to have.
yeah.
TR Dollar said, inclusive design principles reminds me of a paper from Dr. Jetta Tavares from 2016, Lifelong Learning on Inclusive Web. And they also dropped the link. Thank you for that, TR Dollar.
Oh,
Okay, there was one, oh, darn, I hope I didn't forget it. There's one more thing I wanted to ask you about. Oh, yes. So I wanted to round this out for the people who are interested in web accessibility as a career, whether that be as a specialist or an actual web accessibility engineer. What is some advice that you would give them to kind of get them on the path of this kind of field?
sure. So I've met a lot of other engineers and talked to folks and their backgrounds and that kind of stuff. And I will say, if you're coming from a front end development background, you're going to have a bit of an edge up because you understand what's going on in the DOM. You understand what kind of things can be affected by JavaScript. And hopefully you have some understanding of semantic HTML. However, a lot of developers also are kind of weak on HTML. I mean, they may understand how to make something work, but they may not understand how to make it semantic. So the first place that anyone should start is like understanding HTML, CSS to some extent, at least in terms of how it can affect accessibility. And, practicing by going to a web page and using the inspector in the browser to look at how HTML is created, like what different elements are, why you might use one over the other. And then, a lot of browsers also have an accessibility tree. So it will give you not just the DOM layout of the page, but the accessibility layout of the page. How does the browser view semantically each of these components? Divs are generic, but a heading has a role of heading. And that's kind of a deep topic, but
Mm-hmm.
look up accessibility tree and look at those two things. And then I would say, um, I didn't do this myself because I didn't know about it at the time, but I definitely think folks should look at the DHS Trusted Tester
Oh my
certification because
God.
it's free. Yeah, it's free and it goes over a lot of stuff. It doesn't have you use a screen reader or assistive technology, but it does go over a lot of other tools, and it'll give you a good basis for like what to look for to understand what accessibility problems even are.
Right. What I like about the DHS Trusted Tester, speaking of not using a screen reader, the tool Andy, which I'll just put in here, you guys can Google it. Andy, what I like about Andy is it's not like super automated in that it's like scanning a page for something and then telling you what's wrong. It's just like literally telling you what's on the page, and then it gives you the output of what the screen reader would read if there was a screen reader on the page. And as someone who's gone through it, whenever I use the screen reader and then look at the input for Andy, it's almost always pretty much on point. So even though it doesn't replace the screen reader, it still gives you an idea of how a screen reader is kind of reading the page if you like use it as an extension. So it's really DHS Trusted Tester. It's so hard too. It's so hard to pass that thing. Like, oh my gosh. It's like one of the hardest tests I've ever taken. And I've taken some hard tests.
Yeah.
So that brings me back around nicely to the question I had in the beginning. So you talked about some of those certifications from IAAP, which is the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. This is an association that has a bunch of different web accessibility certifications, including the CPAC, which is the Certified Professionals of Accessibility. I don't know,
Core
something.
competency.
Core
Yeah,
competence.
accessibility, core competencies. Yeah.
And then they also have the WAS, which is the Web Accessibility Specialist certification, which goes through the more technical things of like how to build accessible components. So you talked about the fact that you got some of those, and we also talked about the DHS
Yes.
Trusted Tester. Do you think that these are good certifications for people who are interested in breaking into the field, or even maybe they're in the field and they want to learn more? Are they worth the effort of getting, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think CPAC is probably worth getting. A lot of job postings do say they give preference to someone with an IAAP certification. Um, I took them in the opposite order. I took the WAS first just because I had that developer background, and then I took CPAC. But I think for someone who's just starting, CPAC is the better choice. I think
Mm-hmm.
nowadays they're also they're looking to you to have worked as an accessibility engineer for a little while
Mm-hmm.
before you can do the WAS certification. So yeah, I would definitely start with CPAC. Um, but I think in terms of learning how to do testing, the DHS Trusted Tester is like where I would
Absolutely.
start. Even above CPAC.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think that's and just from and cost everything because yeah, CPAC is
Six
going
hundred
to cost you a lot of
dollars.
money and DHS Trusted Tester is free,
Right,
so
right.
you can get a job with that.
Right. If you do the DHS tester, you know how to do the job. Period. I'm like, if you got through that,
Yeah.
you know what you're
Yeah.
doing. You can't fake it.
Yep.
There's no getting around it. Um,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
the CPAC, what I mean, my view on it is, if you're already in deep like us, getting the CPAC, it kind of does make sense. But if you're a newbie, there's a really good intro to web accessibility edX course that will give you at least like a free
Yeah.
overview of some of that information that you might be learning from the CPAC. And then to round out our conversation, and guys, you can ask questions now, and I'll read through them in a little second. But we we have this web accessibility study group where we're literally going through the body of knowledge for the CPAC, which gives you all of that background information of like the foundations of web accessibility, and accessibility in general, just disability theory and some laws and a little bit of history. So we're going to be learning that first as we go through that body of knowledge. And then we'll go through the web accessibility specialization. I'm like, my brain is getting fuzzed up now, but the WAS will also go through that
It's the
body of
weekend.
knowledge. So we're very, very excited to have you, because the way that you explain things, I feel like you're just like a walking dictionary of like, just like knowing how to do things. And I'm just like, I can't wait. This is going to be so good. But yeah. Yeah. So is there anything else that you wanted to share with us, or for us to walk away with knowing?
I was just going to answer another question that was in the
Oh yeah, we're
chat,
gonna
if
end with the
that's
questions
okay.
and then wrap it up again. This is more
Oh,
me
okay.
me curious
Well,
at
yeah,
the
let's just
end.
do that then. Oh, um, I mean, go for it. I would just say that we need more people in this field. It's fun. I think it's pretty satisfying. Yeah, you don't need to be super technical to get into it. HTML is not that difficult to learn. Um, so yeah, if you're interested in helping people with disabilities and just making information, more accessible to everyone, dive in.
Yeah, big agree. All right, let's get into some of these questions. Hulda asks, and I did answer, but in case for those who can't see my screen, Hulda asks, question on the DHS. Do you need a Windows computer to do the DHS? I don't have one. No, you don't need a Windows, even though it says DHS Trusted Tester for Windows. I have a Mac, and I did it with a Mac, and I also did it with a Windows computer, and I kind of navigated between my work computer and my personal computer, and it was fine. Hulda asks, in addition to talks and alley office hours, cool name by the way, are there any other tools? Oh, that's what I forgot to ask you. You have to answer that. Sorry.
Okay.
Are there any tools? Well, my question is, what are your favorite accessibility tools to test? Don't answer that yet. Answer this one first,
Okay.
which is, are there any tools you've created to train or get people to understand accessibility? Amazing question.
I've just done kind of versions of some of my talks, but like tailored to the audience that I work with. So I've got 4 or 5 different training videos available for folks internally, along with the PowerPoint slides and stuff like that. And so as a dev team has questions, I'll just present that information to them. But that's kind of where we are right now.
So I just put your blog in the chat. Rachel has her blog. Their blog has so many things on there to like teach you about forms and about inclusive design and all the other topics. I would share my screen, but I'm scared it's gonna mess everything up. So I'm gonna just not do that. But click on the link. You have a bunch of topics on there, right? Let me actually, I have
Yes.
it up already. So if you go to talks, and actually, we're gonna do this on the fly. I'm gonna share my screen, and I think it should be showing you the right one. Is it scrolling? All right, let me just quickly do this. I just have to fix the properties. Display. Okay. All right. So if you go to their blog, you go to talks. There's a talk on structuring accessible forms. there's a talk on the web is inherently accessible, and then you have all the links for here too. Accessibility testings on here, using JAWS screen reader to create a better digital content, making streaming videos inclusive. That's another thing that we didn't get to really talk about, which is something that I find interesting because I only do web accessibility and things for like forms and PDFs and documents and stuff like that. But you were talking about making streaming like on a TV or on like Netflix and things like that more accessible. Is there anything you could tell us about that as well? Like just some little tidbits
Sure.
to feed the family, the accessibility family that's gathered.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
sure.
So yeah,
So yeah,
we
we
tested
tested
different streaming
different streaming
devices. So
devices.
like
So
an
like an
Xbox,
Xbox,
Apple
an
TV, a
Apple
Samsung
TV, a
TV,
Samsung
a Fire
TV,
Stick,
a Fire Stick, and some other devices, and kind of compared what was the experience for somebody doing that. Do things work with a keyboard? Do they work with the remote? Is there a focus indicator? Stuff like that. And you'll see a lot of things that sometimes get overlooked on the web are actually done pretty well for TV, like focus indicator, because folks are typically navigating with a remote, which is like navigating with a keyboard. So it has to be clear where your focus is on the screen. Some apps do this a little bit better than others, but that's definitely something you have to be aware of is focus indicators. And so often on the web, those get disabled for whatever reason or turned
Mm-hmm.
off. And so keyboard users really struggle, but that's done really something that's done really well on streaming devices. Um, Another one is the concept of live regions. So on the web, we use ARIA Live to announce dynamic changes like success messages or error messages to assistive technology users. And we have to have the same thing for streaming video as well. So, and this takes into account a couple things. One, each of these devices has its own screen reader that sounds different than if you're used to using JAWS or NVDA or VoiceOver. This is yet 6 more screen readers you have to think about. The only one that had any overlap with things that I'd used before was the Xbox uses the same narrator screen reader that's available in Windows, though not a lot of folks use that, but it is there, used much more on Xbox. Yeah, and you have to make sure that these dynamic messages are actually announced with the screen reader when they appear on the page. And so we found some instances where that wasn't always the case. And then I would say the third one, and this comes up a lot, it's very similar to native mobile app testing, but making sure that controls that are buttons are actually announce themselves as buttons so that folks know that they do something, and then also giving them an accessible name. So a lot of times there would be these buttons that maybe were just an icon, like for example, adding a show to your list, and these buttons wouldn't always have a good accessible name so that you understood how to use the control.
Interesting. I didn't know, like, I had no clue that there was so much to consider for streaming. I only just the other day realized that my TV had a screen reader because it started
Oh,
talking. And I was like, what? I was like, this sounds like Jaws. Like, is there a screen reader on here? I was like, oh my gosh. And that got me really thinking about it. Like, oh man, there's like a whole world that I haven't even thought about when it comes to this. All right, I'm gonna answer a few more questions in the chat.
okay.
Emma asked, can you take the trusted tester if not in the US? Yes, you can. I'm pretty sure you can. You just go to the website and go through the process. The question would be, is anyone going to recognize your trusted tester certification in Sweden? I don't know. Maybe they will, but at the very least, you will know testing like the back of your hand for yourself. I am curious if trusted tester is something that's recognized outside of the U.S. It's mostly for the government here. So if you work for the government, they have Section 508, which are our accessibility laws that go through the American with Disabilities Act. So it follows to a T the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, not 2.2, which is the current one. So it goes through that like very line by line ish, where you test all of those things. So even though it's for the US, it's still the international laws that we all use, which is WCAG. So it still applies. So that leads me to believe that maybe some international companies may pay attention to it because it's so robust, but I'm just not too sure. Do you know anything about that, Rachel?
I don't. I know that there are a lot of folks in India who have done DHS Trusted Tester, but I think maybe they work for companies that have contracts with the government. I'm not sure, but yeah. So I know you can take it outside. But yeah, that's a really good question. If like a company in Europe or Asia or something would look to DHS Trusted
Well,
Tester. I don't
Hilda
know.
just said, I work with engineers in India. If they are hired to work with US companies, I believe that DHS trusted certification can be handy. So pretty much you can take it if you're
Okay.
overseas. It just depends like whether or not the company you're working with will care. So that's an interesting thing to think about. I have another question. TR Dollar asks, wondering if you've seen the APCA contrast calculator from Mindex and have any thoughts about it. I clicked on it. I have no clue. I didn't know about it, and I don't have any thoughts. I don't know if you clicked on it, Rachel, but it's pretty much just
Yeah.
a website, I guess. With is APCA something I should know about, or I don't know, Mindex?
I I haven't heard of this before, but it looks pretty similar to other color contrast tools that I've looked at. So yeah, it's kind of cool how it shows you the different font weights. I haven't seen that before. So that could be useful information because definitely sometimes things look like they're, good contrast, but if you're using a really light font weight, then maybe it's not so great.
Yes, yes. I think about
I'm
that a
also,
lot.
yeah, I haven't seen this output for the contrast, like the default value says 75.6, so I guess that's relative luminescence maybe, but yeah, typically I see them show you contrast ratio between the two colors. So yeah, that's different. I wouldn't know how to convert that if I needed to, but it looks cool.
Yeah, it has a lot more options than the average ones do, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's all of the questions. Let me double check. All right, I will see if anyone has any more questions, but we have pretty much come to the end of our coffee chat. Um, man, so now you have one last chance to tell us one more thing on our way out. Something we just
Oh.
you want a little nugget for us. If we don't know anything, what should we know?
Please, please, please make stuff work with a keyboard.
Oh my
That
god.
is like the most critical thing. Anybody can do it too. Like you don't have to be technical. You can be business person, you can be risk person, you can be developer, designer. Try it with a keyboard. Don't use your mouse.
Yeah. Use the tab button and see if you can tab into all of the areas you need to tab. That's it. And if you
Yep.
can't, you got to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to make it able to do that. Someone will be able to help
Yep.
you.
Yes.
All right, my friends, it has been amazing. Thank you so much. We will have more of Rachel around with us. Very excited about that, to have such a knowledgeable person. Um, is it tabbable? Exactly. That's a good question to ask, Hilda. But yeah, thank you so much for hanging out with us, everyone. We'll be here again next week with another person. I have to look at my calendar and figure out when that will be, and I'll let y'all know on Twitter. If you have any questions about anything, hit me up on Twitter. Do you want to put your Twitter or anything for anyone to follow you?
Sure. I'll just type my Twitter handle in
Okay.
there real quick. It's just my name, y'all.
All right. And then for anyone still in here with me, just to let y'all know, we have a Discord for the Web Accessibility Study Group now. I put the link in the discussions area of our GitHub repo. So if you want that go there. If you can't find that for some reason, just send me a DM or message on Twitter and I will send it to you. So that's the best area to go if you want to be up on all of the announcements of when we're going to be doing things and all that stuff. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you so much, Rachel, for hanging out with us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. You too, Hilda. Bye, TR Dollar. All right, bye, y'all.